Russia's war machine has been left without fuel and without armor, without tanks, without armored personnel carriers, and without any protection. Putin's troops are being sent to Ukrainian positions almost unarmed and unprotected. The result is mass casualties. This is no longer a war, but a slaughter. And with each passing day, the situation only gets worse. We're heading to Toretsk. Putin has long since sacrificed everything. The war of Russia in 2024 has not subsided since then, as Putin's troops try to capture a Ukrainian city and Russian forces slowly advance. By January 2025, they had occupied about 88% of the city, and the assaults continue. On June 11 alone, there were as many as 20 combat clashes in the Toretsk direction. Russia failed in all of these clashes, losing 35 soldiers. The main point is that Putin persists with the offensive, confident that he can capture Toretsk with very little remaining distance. At least that's how it appears initially. In reality, Putin's offensive on Toretsk has stalled for a simple reason. Russia no longer has any armored vehicles left to support its troops in this region.
This shocking statement was made by Infoservice Odin, which has a total of 1.76 million subscribers. Infoservice specializes in analyzing military situations, conflicts, maneuvers, and the movements of armed forces from different countries. The analysis of the battles for Toretsk showed that Russia is not providing its advancing soldiers with armored vehicles. And the question is, why can't they keep up with producing replacements for destroyed equipment? If there really were such problems, then Putin would be more willing to negotiate. Or is the increased number of raids on Kyiv actually a sign that things are going badly in the rear and that they urgently need to pressure either Ukraine or America?
So, on July 6th, Ukraine published comments from the Chief of Staff of the Battalion of Unmanned Systems of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Operating under the call sign Parapel, this Chief of Staff reported that Russia has not used armored vehicles in Toretsk for a long time. For roughly 6 weeks, there have been no observed armored assaults, Parapel explains. Instead, Putin had to return to a tactic that has already cost him hundreds of thousands of soldiers since the beginning of the invasion, the so-called human wave assault. The primary assaults are suicide attacks in groups of 2 or 3, according to Parapel. Sometimes these assaults are partially successful, adds Parapel. Small groups of unarmored Russian soldiers sometimes capture trench positions, but fail to hold them for long. Parapel and his comrades usually drive them out with drones, and then destroy the trenches along with the soldiers inside. Putin's campaign to capture Toretsk has turned into desperate attempts to reclaim territory using soldiers without armor, and this strategy is being used because there is no more armored equipment left in Toretsk.
Maybe it's a local problem. Russia is gathering an armored fist for an offensive somewhere else, and in the meantime, they're sending thousands of soldiers to die, which the leadership in Moscow doesn't care about at all. The women say they'll give birth to new ones.
The former war correspondent published a loud headline. Remember this date. Russia has practically run out of armored vehicles. According to EKS, Russia has lost around 20,000 combat vehicles since the start of the Ukraine war. And that means most Russian soldiers are no longer fighting under the protection of armor on any significant scale. Instead, they're lucky if they have any armor at all. Some, such as in Toretsk, are forced to attack without any protection. Writing for Isaac Haight says that he was initially skeptical about the claims, but as he continued to read his materials, he understood the essence of the idea being expressed. Russia hasn't run out of armored vehicles. It still has thousands of units that can be used in Ukraine. The problem Putin faces is that the combination of losses and low production rates means Russia can no longer maintain an armored vehicle fleet large enough to achieve any significant successes in Ukraine. Russia's losses have been enormous. Although both X and Gates cite a figure of about 20 pieces of equipment, Ukraine's Ministry of Finance claims that this number is much higher. According to its data, as of July 9th, Russia had lost 22,969 of its armored combat vehicles, with 2 more lost on July 8th alone. Added to this are the losses of 11,000 tanks, which brings the total to 33,969 armored vehicles lost. Keep in mind that the war in Ukraine has been going on for about 41 months now. This means that Russia is losing about 828 armored vehicles per month. For a while, Russia managed to handle such losses, particularly regarding tanks. Russia claimed that in 2024 it produces about 1,500 units per year, says Diets. This occurred when it was losing around 1,400 tanks annually, but issues were still emerging. Most of the 1,500 tanks Russia produced were not new. The vast majority of these are tanks that were taken out of storage and restored, with parts from other old tanks used for repairs. Such an almost one-to-one replacement ratio is impossible to maintain in the long term, especially considering that the quality of replacements continues to decline, writes Gates. He also adds that Russia has announced it will double its production rate in 2025 and now expects to produce several thousand tanks by 2027. However, these statements should be viewed with some skepticism. The huge stockpiles of tanks and armored vehicles from the Soviet era are not endless, notes Gates. Eventually, Russia will run out of them, and then the losses it is already suffering will become fully apparent.
The Russians had an almost unlimited supply of Soviet tanks. Often, one tank served as a source of spare parts for another. In other cases, the manufacturer replaced worn-out or non-functioning components produced during the development process. Russia thus produced, repaired, and added 1,400 tanks per year, while losing 1,500. But the stock of old vehicles began to run out.
NATO estimates show that Russia can continue military operations at the current level until 2027, provided there are further economic sacrifices and no serious escalation, writes Gates. However, other analysts warn that Russia may run out of usable tanks as early as 2026 if the current rate of losses continues, and if restoring old models becomes impossible. Although Russia may be able to suppress internal dissent and continue fighting, the associated economic, political, and military costs continue to rise. The armored vehicle situation in Russia is already critical.
Advancing with infantry without cover, especially in the age of drones, is suicide, ladies and gentlemen. You can dig in and defend, but Russia wants to capture, not defend. It seems that the Kremlin's strategy is to throw everything into capturing the regions that have been officially declared Russian, and then agree to a ceasefire while pretending they're ready to fight for as long as it takes. But in reality, to use negotiations as a pause, either to bargain for good terms or to start military actions again. But there is also some amusing news. The tanks and armored personnel carriers started running out of fuel and...
Take donkeys, for example. Russia uses donkeys as well as some horses to transport equipment back and forth. During the war in Ukraine, Russia tries to present all this as something ordinary, notes Texty. The article quotes Russian Lieutenant General Viktor Sobolev. Right now, there are major difficulties in supplying units, including assault units with ammunition, equipment, and food. If donkeys, horses, and camels are used to deliver ammunition and other supplies to the front line, that's normal. He may not have meant it that way, but Sobolev essentially admitted that Russia doesn't have enough equipment to transport supplies. He's talking about major difficulties, which basically can be interpreted as Ukraine has destroyed so much of our equipment that we have to use donkeys and horses.
It's a pity, isn't it?
I feel sorry for the donkeys. But it is trying to deal with its armor crisis. Russia is attempting to address the armored vehicle issue differently by deploying soldiers in compact cars. In February, Texty reported that Russian soldiers were seen riding in Zhiguli cars in Ukraine, providing photos as evidence. These are compact cars from Soviet times that were never intended for use on the battlefield. They're not even new vehicles. Russia is sending soldiers to fight in cars that were considered low quality decades ago and now are nothing more than cannon fodder for Ukrainian drones and artillery. Forbes has reported similar accounts. AKSA mentioned in March that Russia is also using Lada vehicles. These are not armored vehicles, but rather cars that a Russian could purchase from a dealership at home, which are now being utilized in Ukraine. The AKS report talked about a Lada that got stuck in the snow and mud of Ukraine, where it remained until it was destroyed by Ukrainians. Russia is already using various types of vehicles and even animals due to its shortage of armored vehicles. And just like with the heavy losses from the so-called meat assaults, this problem will only get worse as Russia's Soviet stockpiles run out. We'll see more donkeys, horses, laders, and similar vehicles. Because Russia simply has nothing else to transport equipment or soldiers.
Of course, Russia does produce new cars, armored personnel carriers, and armored vehicles. It's just that they're being produced in smaller numbers than are being destroyed in Ukraine. But the Russians have another problem, actually a similar one.
Russia will not have enough main battle tanks to conduct effective offensive operations after the beginning of 2026, if it maintains the same pace of operations and suffers the same losses as in 2024, writes X in his article Trench Art from July 7. This exacerbates the armored vehicle problem, resulting in terrible news for Putin. Russia will not be able to continue ground assaults with the same intensity as it did in the first 3 years of the war. This means fewer captured territories, more soldier deaths, and worsening problems with Russia's armored vehicles. From bad to much worse.
So what is the Kremlin planning to do if the gambit to seize the territory of the 4 regions doesn't work? The tactic is called Marshal Zhukov, and it consists of the Russians sending hundreds of thousands of poorly armed, poorly trained soldiers to the front. They attack in waves, retreat, then attack again. The Ukrainians use up bullets, grenades, shells, and become exhausted both physically and morally. They need to be replaced. They need to rest, but there's no one to replace them. Ukrainians, well, millions have fled from the war, and young people under 25 aren't being drafted into the army at all. Many, when they reach 24 or 25 years old, disappear from the military enlistment office's radar. That's why Ukraine is catching recruits aged 25 to 60 on the streets, in movie theaters, and at markets. Russia is calling up 30 to 40,000 recruits a month and isn't stopping. Despite claiming to call up more, the numbers indicate around 340,000. Ukraine doesn't have the right to lose 3,000 of its own soldiers after destroying 30,000 Russians. Even a 10-to-1 ratio is an irreparable loss for Ukraine. Today, there are 3 times more Russian soldiers in Ukraine than there were at the moment when Russia invaded the territory of its neighbor, brother, and friend.
He has the manpower, but he doesn't have the armored vehicles necessary for that manpower to make a difference. We see the consequences of this problem during Russia's summer offensive. Although Russia has increased the pace and number of its offensives in Ukraine over the past couple of months, it is capturing nowhere near as much territory as Putin had hoped. According to the data, Russian troops are advancing at a rate of about 8.5 kilometers per day, but that's simply not enough. No major cities are being captured. Russia is only reclaiming small areas, increasingly relying on meat assaults. Since armored vehicles are now becoming such a serious problem, Putin's future invasion looks bleak. The leader of Russia will continue the offensive. He will keep sacrificing thousands of his soldiers for the sake of capturing Ukraine. But with each new assault, the captured territories will become smaller as the armored vehicles disappear. Russia's ground attacks will eventually almost completely cease. When the piles of bodies grow and Putin realizes that the war of attrition he started has weakened his own army.
Analysis conclusion. The war in Ukraine has destroyed Putin's army, which he called the second in the world. So today it's not third, not fourth, not fifth. Probably at best it can claim 11th place. The United States is in first place, of course, then China, India, England, South Korea, Japan, France, Turkey, Israel. Even Israel is stronger than the Russian army today. And only after them does the Institute for the Study of War in Washington rank today's Russian army. And what about Ukraine? As it turned out, living under pressure and threat develops mental abilities.
Ukraine has just deployed one of the most exciting and innovative military technologies the world has ever seen, and it is making Russia's air force absolutely useless. It's called an artificial intelligence-powered machine gun turret with the intelligence and firepower to easily shoot down Russian drones and missiles. Let's take a closer look at what it is, how it was created, and what it can do. At first glance, it may not seem revolutionary or impressive. It consists of an M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a rotating turret that can turn a full 360 degrees. And it can fire at targets all around itself. There's nothing new about that. Similar turrets have been used in military operations for decades. Operators manually aim the guns, adjust the elevation angle, and choose the moment to fire. But it doesn't need a human operator. It's fully controlled by artificial intelligence without any manual intervention. The artificial intelligence handles everything from target detection to aiming and opening fire. Ukrainian soldiers only need to set up the turret in position and turn it on. After that, they can just watch as everything happens. The Miracle Intelligence Controller was completely developed in Ukraine, and one of its main advantages is its affordability. Each installation costs only $150,000. This is incredibly cheap compared to air defense systems like the German infrared imaging system Tail Black Thrust Vector Controlled, which costs about $185 million per installation, or the American one, which costs about $1.1 billion. Of course, it's not as sophisticated or powerful as any of these systems, but it's still a very impressive and effective air defense weapon, more than capable of shooting down many of the aerial threats that Russia can send toward Ukraine. It can easily destroy drones like Shahed, which for example cost about $50,000 each.
As I already told you, new drones are no longer something new and unknown, and ways to counter them are being found. But soon, ways to counter those countermeasures will also be found. I really hope that Trump's doctrine of resolving conflicts economically, rather than by destroying people and property, will become the main way to resolve conflicts on the planet. This matches the proposal of Golambas, Andrei Yosif Golambas, for resolving conflicts without fighting. Rather, to end existing wars and make it unprofitable to start new ones. But not only Russian weapons, but also the personnel have been disgraced. Along with them, Chinese products have also gone down the conventional drain. Caption: communists can't make anything decent.
You see, over the past 2 decades, China's defense industry has developed rapidly and flooded the markets of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Most buyers are countries that could not afford Western weapons or were restricted by political barriers such as sanctions and embargoes. Countries like Iran and Pakistan had virtually no choice and were forced to rely heavily on Chinese weapons. Iran, for example, has faced tough Western sanctions, especially from the United States since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Before that, Iran's armed forces mainly relied on modern American and European equipment. The country even had some of the best American fighter jets, such as the F-14 Tomcat. But after 1979, when relations with the West collapsed almost overnight, Tehran was left with almost no other options. Of course, Russia was one of the options, but Iranian leaders never fully trusted Moscow, and Russian weapons were often expensive and not always reliable. China took advantage of this opportunity and constantly undercut prices compared to Russia, while claiming to offer the same or even more advanced technology. As a result, Tehran ended up being heavily dependent on Chinese weaponry for decades.
That is, everywhere the United States and Europe refused to sell for political reasons, Russia and China started selling instead. The buying countries got everything they wanted, but the money went not to us, but to Moscow and Beijing. The buyers were satisfied with everything. China and Russia were happy, and we were punishing ourselves. But thank God, the communists still can't do anything properly.
The history of Pakistan is in many ways similar to that of the 1990s. Pakistan was mainly equipped with American and Western equipment, especially during the Cold War, when it was a key ally of the United States in countering Soviet influence in Afghanistan. But after Pakistan's nuclear tests in 1998, everything changed. The United States immediately imposed strict sanctions, almost overnight stopping the supply of military equipment. Left with no other options, Pakistan strengthened its friendship with China, which readily flooded Islamabad with affordable fighter jets, tanks, missiles, and ships, quickly becoming Pakistan's main and essentially only supplier of military equipment.
Well, I mean, Western countries love to shoot themselves in the foot, as the popular American saying goes.
Moreover, for decades, China has consistently produced impressive examples of weaponry, often presenting each new model as a breakthrough, and sometimes even boldly claiming that they significantly surpass their Western counterparts. For example, back in the 1990s and 2000s, China actively promoted advanced missile technologies in its own fighter jets, such as the J-17, which quickly became the main combat aircraft of Pakistan. By 2010, China introduced the stealth fighter J-20, boldly claiming that it could easily compete with or even surpass American aircraft such as the F-22 and F-35. Around the same time, new anti-ship missiles, precision-guided bombs, and modern radar systems were regularly making headlines, always promising Western-level effectiveness at a fraction of the cost. This created the illusion that Chinese technology was on par with Western military equipment. This made Chinese weapons extremely attractive to countries like Iran and Pakistan, which desperately needed modern arms but could not afford or access Western options. After spending tens of billions of dollars, these countries were confident that they now possessed advanced arsenals powerful enough to defend themselves or even challenge opponents like Israel and India. But as you will soon discover, they only acquired a costly collection of useless items.
Israel, France, India, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and of course the United States used Western-made products. It became possible to compare Russian and Chinese products with Western ones during the Israeli-Iranian conflict. Well, or war, as they call it.
In the early hours of June 13, 2025. In the early hours of June 13, 2025, Israel launched a massive preemptive strike aimed at completely disabling Iran's military potential in one swift move, under the cover of darkness. Modern Israeli stealth fighters, F-35I, silently penetrated Iranian airspace, easily destroying key systems
Of air defense?
such as the Russian F-300 Kadiat. There are even rumors that they hit the Chinese air defense control system JY-10, missile systems K-802, a radar that is supposedly capable of tracking 100 targets simultaneously within an 800-kilometer radius. But guess what? This system couldn't even track a single fighter, let alone return fire with missiles. A few minutes later, high-speed anti-radiation missile missiles hit all the designated Iranian radar stations, blinding their radars. The crews of the Iranian missile systems suddenly found themselves blind and helpless. Right behind the Israeli F-35S, dozens of Israeli F-15Y Striker and F-16E fighters followed, each armed with high-precision bombs and missile weaponry. Over the next several hours, these fighter drones systematically destroyed Iranian military commanders, nuclear scientists, missile facilities, radar installations, and virtually all important targets that had been planned. It was at this moment of humiliating collapse that the Chinese propaganda machine stepped in, desperately trying to minimize the damage to its reputation. Official Chinese media and affiliated websites immediately began publishing outrageous statements, such as boasting about the 80% effectiveness of their air defense systems in Iran. But in reality, many of these systems were reduced to dust before they could track anything at all.
In Russia and China, there is a dome that shields the population from any external information, even when the population receives conflicting information. Conflicts and messages, as they say, are still the work of their own state's propaganda, which, for some reason, needs to provide conflicting information to perfectly brainwash its population.
An Iranian military officer, speaking anonymously to a foreign publication, allegedly admitted that their air defense systems were supposed to be advanced, but in reality turned out to be just modern, only for show, not for real combat. You might think that after such humiliation, Iran would be furious with China, right? But it turns out Tehran can be even more foolish than we thought. Recent reports indicate that Iran plans to spend tens of billions of dollars more to restore its national chemical sector. And guess where they're planning to shop? In China.
Honestly, I don't believe that the Iranian leadership are complete idiots. It just means that for some reason they needed not to fall out with China. And to hell with it if it costs some 10 or 20 billion dollars. From their point of view, the life of Ayatollah is worth that money and even more.
Initially, Iran wanted to buy Russian fighter jets, but the Kremlin simply doesn't sell them. Moscow needs absolutely all of its combat aircraft for the ongoing war in Ukraine. Besides, as I mentioned earlier, price matters. And Chinese aircraft are much cheaper and apparently more available than Russian Mu-35, which makes them much more attractive despite their weak combat performance. Which is truly remarkable. And perhaps the most absurd reason why Iran is still willing to trust Chinese weapons is the so-called success of Chinese fighter jets in the recent four-day war between India and Pakistan. Most people don't realize this, but much of the news coming out of the conflict in India was fueled by powerful Chinese propaganda. The Chinese statements were so convincing that they even affected the stock price of the Chinese fighter jet manufacturer. According to the Chinese version of events, the Pakistani army supposedly achieved impressive victories over the much stronger United States of India, mainly thanks to Chinese-made fighter jets like the J-10. They claim that Pakistani pilots shot down several modern French Rafale fighter jets, but this statement was completely refuted by independent sources. And just a few days after boasting about fake victories over Indian fighter jets, Chinese state media even released a two-part documentary dedicated to the development of the J-10 fighter jet.
It's amazing how propaganda works. You can lose a battle, but create the impression for everyone that you won it.
But even the Chinese were shocked by him, to be honest. But to be honest, even the Chinese themselves were shocked at how poorly their weapons performed in Iran. Given the strategic partnership between China and Iran, something had to be done urgently to fix this embarrassment. Iran desperately hoped that China would openly support it, but Beijing chose a more covert approach. On June 14th, while Israel was still striking targets on Iranian territory, at least 5 747 cargo planes took off from different locations in China and headed west along a discrete route, flying through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, before suddenly disappearing from radar as they entered Iranian airspace. Officially, the destination listed in the documents for these flights was Luxembourg, but none of them actually entered European airspace. And what makes these mysterious disappearances especially significant is that Boeing 747 cargo planes are regularly used to transport military equipment, and China has a history of secretly providing military aid to countries and proxies that oppose the West. Therefore, assisting Iran fits perfectly into Beijing's broader geopolitical ambitions. Both countries openly oppose the United States, led world order and advocate for a multipolar world. Moreover, considering that almost all Chinese weapon systems in Iran have suffered a crushing failure, these covert deliveries could have been a hidden attempt by China to mend relations with Tehran in order to prevent a disgraceful weapons failure that could completely destroy their strategic ties.
Their interests coincided. China doesn't want Iran to break free from the mullahs, and the Iranian mullahs want protection from China and are willing to pay for it. China has developed tense relations with Pakistan.
After the ceasefire on May 13th, the aerospace and defense industry index plummeted by about 8 to 9%, which effectively wiped billions off the market overnight. Evik Chengdu Aircraft, the manufacturer of Pakistan's J-10 and J-17 fighter jets, saw its shares drop from about 95.86 yuan on May 12th to 76.70 yuan in just 2 weeks, losing more than 20%. The company supplying Pakistan with advanced missiles like the PL-15 also suffered losses of about 6 to 9% during the same period. The irony is that instead of Pakistan getting angry at China because of the poor performance of the weapons, the opposite happened. Beijing became furious with Islamabad. Chinese analysts blamed the Pakistani military, claiming that the failure was due to their insufficient training and poor handling, not flaws in the Chinese weapons themselves.
Naturally, the scapegoat was found. The Chinese press lashed out at the so-called scapegoats from Islamabad for mishandling the excellent Chinese weapons. China tried to force Pakistan to hide and destroy everything that was left of their broken equipment. But why can't China make or even copy Western technology?
Why exactly did Chinese weaponry fail? Why exactly was Chinese weaponry so ineffective when it really mattered? It all comes down to a few key factors: stolen designs, low-quality control, corruption, and a lack of real combat experience. As I mentioned at the beginning, most Chinese weapons are essentially copies or hybrids of foreign models. Instead of spending years and billions on their own research and development from scratch, China often steals or copies foreign models, especially from the United States and Russia, and then just reverse engineers them for mass production. First of all, it takes China several years to steal highly classified military technologies, and then several more years to study and reproduce them through reverse engineering. Because of this slow and inefficient process, most Chinese weaponry is already outdated by the time it is deployed. And even then, they often have trouble copying and reproducing things correctly because they're not very good at reverse engineering. Just because China can build something similar, it doesn't mean it works just as well. For instance, the long-range HQ-9 surface-to-air missile systems failed dramatically in Pakistan. China proudly claimed that this system could rival the Russian S-300 and the American Patriot systems. But guess why they made such a comparison? Because the HQ-9 was literally created based on stolen blueprints of the Russian S-300.
Not only from the West, but also from Russia. We thought they were just thieves, but it's more complicated. So the United States produces a certain system, the Russians steal it, and then China steals it from them. By the time China started producing the stolen technology and selling it around the world, the United States, Israel, and France had already developed the next generation of the same or completely different weapons. But China produces everything in huge quantities, and China hasn't fought a serious war or tested anything in real combat conditions for 40 years. What have they actually produced over there?
The only reason China has managed to cover these? The only reason China has managed to hide these problems for so long is that it hasn't fought any large-scale wars for more than 4 decades. Their weapons haven't undergone proper combat testing. Western, and to a lesser degree, Russian systems have been routinely used in actual combat scenarios. For example, Russian S-300 and S-400 air defense missile systems in Syria were not able to completely stop Israeli airstrikes, but they still achieved certain limited successes. Historically, even outdated air defense systems sometimes achieve successful hits. For example, the Serbian missile system from the 1960s became famous for shooting down the American stealth aircraft F-117 during the Kosovo War, Hawk during the Kosovo War of 1999. At the same time, Chinese radars and missiles supplied to Iran and Pakistan failed to achieve even a single successful hit, which clearly demonstrates the low effectiveness of this weapon. But then why do Iranian and Pakistani leaders continue to insist on buying Chinese weapons despite constant failures? It's simple. Corruption is deeply rooted in the buyer countries as well. Chinese arms deals are often accompanied by generous loans or diplomatic concessions, such as investments through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. What makes such agreements very attractive for cash-strapped governments and beneficial for their politicians? For China, the stakes are now higher than ever. Beijing aims to be not just a regional but a global power, and an important part of this strategy is arms exports and the reputation of its military technology. China is already the 4th largest arms exporter in the world, but recent events have seriously undermined its credibility. After their weapons failed spectacularly in real combat conditions, potential buyers may now think twice. This damage is also being felt domestically. President Xi constantly boasts that he will build a world-class military by the middle of the century, making military power a central pillar of China's national pride. Humiliating failures in Pakistan and Iran combined with disgraceful corruption scandals, like missiles literally filled with water, directly undermine Xi's narrative within China itself.
As a conclusion to everything, let's start with Russia. To this day, Russia has proven that it is unable to capture a significantly less armed and sparsely populated country. B, Russia cannot sustain the production of the necessary weapons in the required quantities. V, sanctions, which, well, maybe in everyday life, especially for residents of Moscow and St. Petersburg, don't really bother them, as they say, but in terms of weapons production, they slow Russia down and slow it down very seriously. So what's the conclusion? Putin's policy becomes clear: to persuade the United States for as long as possible that Russia wants peace, while in reality waiting for the United States and the West to stop helping Ukraine, and either seize all of Ukraine or take control of the regions that Russia has declared as its own. And to do this as quickly as possible, intensifying attacks and destruction, because the Kremlin knows they won't last long. That's why Shoigu was transferred from the position of defense minister to a collector of weapons and personnel around the world, to plug the gaps. And for now, these gaps are being filled with cannon fodder, the bodies of untrained, unprotected conscripts who nobody in the Kremlin cares about. No one feels sorry for them, no one is interested in them. And what about China? After starting the conflict with Trump, the Politburo of the Communist Party of China formed, a national leadership committee, effectively removing Xi Jinping from his leading role as General Secretary and President. Chinese weapons did not just fail, it was a disaster. China was afraid to openly support Iran and preferred to operate behind the scenes. Well, let's say in the dark. They sent them 5 transport planes with additional equipment, but did it in such a way that it was impossible to prove the fact of the delivery. China is in a severe financial crisis, mainly because of the struggle with Trump. And the story with the weapons only makes an even more serious problem with real estate, which no one is buying, and with finances, worse. China now has one good way out of the situation: let the United States into its markets, lower tariffs, increase the range of imported goods, and bring China back to a time of economic prosperity. If they can't remove Xi, or if they can't change China's policy, then in just 3 or 4 years, China will start annexing those parts of Siberia that they consider to be theirs, taken by Russia. I think this will coincide with the collapse of the current Russian government. Maybe Putin's group will leave, or maybe things will go deeper. The process of the collapse of what is called the Russian Federation will begin, but it is already becoming an empire. But that's in the future, before the end of the 2020s. Well, maybe until the early 2030s, but it will definitely happen. Subtitles created by